As you know, we're here today because it's Senior Exhibition Day, and this is the first hour of presentations, so I'm sure everyone's a little bit nervous. I'll be nervous all day, but Kevin gets to only be nervous right now. I want to introduce Kevin. He has been my student for this year, and I actually met Kevin last year when he came to Washington, D.C. I feel very fortunate he chose me to be his mentor this year. And I'm not going to say a whole lot because I'll get emotional. So, he is incredibly thoughtful, and I'm very, very excited to see what he does with the rest of his life. I need to close the door, so Kevin, you're going to have to wait a couple seconds.
Oh, okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. Before I get started, I just wanted to say a big thank you to everybody. I know you're all in spring break mode. It's 9 in the morning. No one wants to be here, but glad you're all here today. It really means a lot. I'd also want to thank my loving family for being here, for all of their love and support the last 4 years. My community evaluator for taking the time out of your day today, as well as my wonderful mentor. Couldn't have asked for anyone better. It's been so much fun. I've been in this room literally every single day since August, asking a question. So, without further ado, as Ms. Peters said, my name is Kevin, and today I'm going to be going over my senior exhibition topic on combating hate crimes. So I wanted to start us off with a really short story about this woman right here named Bertha Germany. She is a middle-aged African-American woman living in the suburbs of northern Texas, and just last December, she was on her way home when she pulled into her driveway and saw that her house had been vandalized. It had been vandalized with swastikas on the side, as well as racial slurs all over. She shared her story on Facebook, and she soon discovered that she wasn't the only one in the neighborhood that had this experience. Other local neighbors had also had their houses vandalized. But what's really interesting is that all owners of the neighboring houses were also African American. This is considered a hate crime because it's both a crime and there was a biased motivation. She went to her local police department to report this crime, but they turned her down. They refused to investigate, and they would not even report it. Soon later did it come out that 82% of hate crimes in Texas in the year 2023 were not reported, were not documented, and were not investigated. You go to your local police department, they don't even do anything about it. So that really raises the essential question of should the federal government mandate that states enforce more consistent hate crime laws? So my answer to that is, while more laws may help reduce the amount of hate crimes, the true solution really relies within the federal law enforcement agencies. But before we get into that, I just wanted to give you guys a super brief overview of where I'm going to be heading. I'm going to start off with some context, answering what are hate crimes, how did we get here today, as well as my arguments. Both are all my claim, counterclaim, and rebuttal. I'm going to answer the essential question with my conclusion, and then I'm going to give you guys the space to ask more questions at the end. And something I really want you guys to remember right now is that each statistic I show you, each number represents one person. These are not numbers, these are real human lives that are being impacted by these hate crimes. So, for some context, what are hate crimes and how did we get here today? So, defined by the US Department of Justice, a hate crime is a crime with a biased motivation, meaning the crime was committed because of someone's race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. And in a personal interview stated with Professor and Lieutenant Jay Kiley, he's a professor at the College of San Mateo and lieutenant of the Burlingame Police Department, he stated that the hate crime title only enhances the punishment, meaning that if you were charged with a crime, if it were to be considered a hate crime, the punishment would be harsher, longer, and more severe. So like if you owed $15 for a crime fine, if it were to be a hate crime, you'd owe $20. Like the punishment would go up, the fine would go up, and so on. And hate crimes can be separated into two categories, both verbal, as well as physical. But for this presentation, we're gonna get started off with physical. So what is a physical hate crime? Physical hate crimes can include any hate crimes that involve assault, vandalism, or any form of property damage. So even though someone may not be physically harmed, if there's some damage to property, it's still considered to be a physical hate crime. And a really interesting statistic I found from the US Department of Justice was that in 2022, of the 3,147 property damage hate crimes reported, 74.1 of those hate crimes were vandalism. We actually see this example in January of 2022. A Rabbi Levi Nodik, in the suburbs of Chicago, walked into his synagogue one morning and noticed that there had been broken windows and swastikas painted on the side. Similar to Bertha, Germany, he was not the only one, and other neighboring establishments had also been vandalized. Except the common ground this time was that all of the victims were Jewish. And we can see the perpetrator doing so here. So now that we know what physical hate crimes are, we're going to get into more verbal hate crimes. And this is where it can get a little sticky because of the First Amendment, which is freedom of speech. So because of that, verbal hate crimes can only be narrowed down to a threat to incite violence against a community. But before we start talking about that, I wanted to give you a little brief overview about how it's different from hate speech. So hate speech is what's protected under the First Amendment, which I said before is freedom of speech. It can include any form of slurs, images, or even protests. So again, because of that, it can really only be boiled down to a threat to incite violence. There has to be an imminent danger present. And because of that, only 44% of verbal hate crimes are reported. Why? In the words of Dr. Caroline Harlow, she is a statistician at the US Department of Justice, she stated that a lot of these hate crimes are not important enough to the respondent. Meaning that if someone were to say something to you, if you were to drive down to your local police department, most of the time it's probably considered hate speech. And that is where they're gonna turn you down because they're practicing their freedom of speech. So again, there's no imminent danger. To clear that up, hate speech is protected under the First Amendment. To further clarify, if you have a motivational bias along with hate speech, that is what we call discriminatory speech, and that is protected under the First Amendment. However, if we still have that motivational bias and we still have that hate speech, there has to be an imminent threat for it to be considered a hate crime, and that's where you can go to your local police department. But now that we know what hate crimes are, we're going to get into a little more of the legislation that we currently have on the federal level. So a lot of anti-discriminatory and anti-hate crime laws came into place around 1968 during the Civil Rights Movement, with both the Conspiracy Against Rights Act and the Violent Interference with Federally Protected Rights Act. They really go hand in hand. The Conspiracy Against Rights Act paved the way for African American men to vote. It took off poll taxes and stuff like that because it declared it unconstitutional to get in anyone's way of practicing their constitutional rights. Same with the violent interference with federally protected rights. It's just about the same thing. This led to the desegregation of schools in the American South. It said that you cannot interfere with anyone on public land. So they kind of go hand in hand. The next piece of legislation we see is in 1988 with the Criminal Interference with Fair Housing Rights Act. This act made it illegal for landlords to discriminate on their tenants, meaning that they can't say no or reject a tenant because of their race, orientation, and so on. I was really surprised. We actually still see this today. Just last year, a Chinese immigrant tried to buy land in Florida, but the Floridian government banned them from doing so on the basis of their national origin. But the 11th Appellate Court in Atlanta was able to declare that unconstitutional, and the law is now gone. Or it's barred for now. It's barred for now. So then in 1996, we see the Damage to Religious Property and Church Arson Prevention Act. This started to expand more rights to religious minorities. So for example, the case with Rabbi Levi Nodik, that went against this act because they were interfering with his right to freedom of religion. But the last piece of legislation we see, and the most recent one, is the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crime Prevention Act. All of the other ones I've mentioned are more anti-discriminatory, but this one is more hate crime along the lines of hate crimes. So Matthew Shepard, he was an LGBTQ individual residing in Wyoming. He was a student, and in the late 90s, he was the victim of a hate crime. He was ganged up on by 3 or 4 men. They beat him and tortured him, and then they didn't kill him, but they left him to rot and die on the side of the road. And he died 6 days after the attack. So because of that, they named this law after him, and they extended the federally protected rights to LGBTQ minorities. And James Byrd Jr., he was not an LGBTQ man. He was an African American man who was, I believe, going on a walk, and 3 white supremacists came up and beat him to death. So this is where we see some of the LGBTQ legislation coming in, as well as more of the hate crime legislation coming in. But those were all federal laws. State laws differ under federalism. And federalism, in easy words, is the balance of power between the state and the federal government. So to clarify that up a bit, the state of California is going to have somewhat the same amount of power as the national government, the entire federal government of the nation. So, why are hate crimes important? What's the demographics of it? So, in a published study from the Department of Justice in 2022, about 60% of hate crimes were because of race, while 17.3 were because of religion, 17.2 were because of sexual orientation, and the rest were because of gender identity, disability, gender, and so on. But if you wanted to see that on a pie chart, here's a nice picture provided by the Department of Justice. But I really wanted to bring this project to a local level, so I did a bit more research. And so these are the demographics of San Francisco since 2020. So to say that one more time, these are the decreases and the increases in hate crimes against certain minority communities since the year 2020. And the most shocking one to me was, of course, the anti-Asian American, which had a 567% increase. Why? Well, from the article I read by Dr. Lardy, he said that it was because of the COVID pandemic. And because of that, he also critiqued our former president, Donald Trump, for saying that the way he referred to it as the China virus and supported the stereotype that all Asians were the same. This put a lot of hatred and blame towards the Asian American community, which is why we see these huge spikes in hate crimes, especially since San Francisco is a major hub for Asian immigrants. We also see a pretty big spike in anti-Jewish and anti-LGBTQ, as well as anti-Black, and a decrease in anti-Muslim and anti-Latinx. So, now that we know all the context of hate crimes, let's get into the argument. Why should there be more accountability? So, to further explain, due to the inconsistency in state laws, Americans across the country are unprotected from hate crimes. So to prove this point, this is a map of the United States, if you can tell. I want you to pick one state. I don't expect you to memorize all of them, just pick one. And I'm going to show you a map of all of the different minority communities, and you tell me if your state is protected of all of them. So, the blue states represent states that have laws in place on the to protect freedom of religion or just religious practices in general. Meaning the blank states don't have any laws in place. A good amount, but not all of them. It's a little inconsistent, right? Let's go to another one, sexual orientation. Not a lot. I mean, a good amount, but still not the same as last time, not 100%. Pretty inconsistent. Now let's look at another one, gender identity. A lot less than the ones compared to before. You see you're starting to see the pattern now, right? Like some states cover some things, but not all. Very inconsistent. Moving on to race, a lot more than before, but still not good enough. Very inconsistent. And lastly, gender, this one surprised me personally. Not a lot of states. So that's still very inconsistent. So out of the states you picked, was your state consistent the entire time? Exactly. So that just goes to show that all of the state legislation is very inconsistent. In a personal interview stated with Dr. Seth Philippe, he is a criminology professor at the Florida Atlantic University, he said that hate crimes are a patchwork of issues merely separated by a state line to handle their situations. How do states handle their situations? So let's take California, San Francisco. As I've said before, there was a 567% increase in Asian American community hate crimes. In response to that, California passed the Asian and Pacific Islander Equity Budget. This provided a 24/7 hotline to call if you're the victim of a hate crime, a tip line to report any tips, as well as they also set up some scholarships for Asian American students pursuing a higher degree in education. So, because of the spike in hate crimes, they passed some laws, they passed some legislation to help curb it down. But hate crime legislation can also depend on the minority community. And when I mean the minority community, I was only able to do it on non-white communities. So African American, Latinx, etc. So in 2023, from the World Population Review, California had a 32.6% minority population, while Wyoming had a 6.4. That explains why California has 6 anti-discrimination and anti-hate crime laws, and Wyoming has 0. But of course, super liberal, super conservative. Of course, that explains it all, right? Well, in my research, it actually was nonpartisan, meaning it doesn't depend on the majority party in place for the legislation. Take Arkansas, pretty conservative state, right? They have a 3.3% LGBTQ population. They have no anti-discrimination laws and no anti-hate crime laws. But let's look at another red state, Utah, still pretty conservative. They have a 3.7% LGBTQ population, and they do have anti-discrimination laws, and they do have protection from hate crimes on federal land. Just a 0.4% difference calls for different legislation. Both red states, nonpartisan. So getting into my counterclaim, aren't there resources already? So again, as previously mentioned, in a interview stated with Professor and Lieutenant Jay Kiley, he stated that a lot of these laws are state specific, meaning a state shouldn't have to implement time, resources, and money on things that aren't a big deal for them. He gets at this idea for this example. Iowa in 2022 had 15 hate crimes reported. Michigan had 377. Why should it be fair that Iowa wastes its tax dollars on implementing laws when it's not a big issue for them compared to other states that have a larger amount of hate crimes? So I also wanted to get at this really major point of aren't there resources already? So Gary Bravo, he was an LGBTQ man living in Huntsville, Alabama. I believe he was a school teacher, and one night on the last day of school, he went out for a drink with his coworkers. Around 2 a.m., when he left the bar, it's right over here, he walked down the street to the burger joint place, and he was ganged up on and beaten and tortured. He was very injured that he actually had to go to the hospital, and it took him a few weeks to recover. His coworkers were also beaten up too. And just like birth in Germany, when he went to the local agencies, they refused to investigate. But what he did was he turned to the FBI, which is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And it's the federal police agency that oversees all 50 states. So compared to local, this is the entire nation. And after he went to the FBI was able to help him out. They were able to hold the suspects accountable, and they were charged with a hate crime. So the FBI already has resources. They have a self-reporting survey, which you can go to directly, 100% anonymous, and it goes towards the data collected at the end of the year, as well as a 24/7 hotline that you can call if you're the victim, as well as a tip line. So in 2022, again from the Department of Justice, 14,361 hate crimes were reported to the FBI. But what's really interesting about that is that of that, 37% of those hate crimes were reported directly to the FBI, meaning someone reported on the survey, called the hotline, they went directly. Whereas only 44% were reported by local agencies, meaning someone went to their local agency and the agency reported it at the end of the year. Just a 7% difference, right? It shows that it's working. But as we get into my rebuttal, it's not enough. Because like I said before, these are people, not numbers. Each of these pieces of statistics represent one human life that was traumatized because of a hate crime, because of an anti-discriminatory act. So usually when you are the victim of a crime, what you do is you go to your local agency. What they're supposed to do is they're supposed to report. They're supposed to investigate. They're supposed to see what's going on. And then they hold the defendant accountable. The unfortunate reality for many others, including Bertha Germany and Gary Bravo, was that when they reported to the agencies refused to investigate. How were they held accountable? They went over their local agencies to the FBI, and the FBI was able to help them out. Because of that, vast amounts of hate crimes go unreported. The lack of oversight in the police agencies caused this problem because they're supposed to investigate, but they don't. So remember that article I talked about at the beginning? The Texas Tribune, 82% of hate crimes went unreported? I'm gonna say it again. 82% of hate crimes in 2023 went unreported. That means 82 out of 100 people that were the victims of hate crimes, their experience, not reported, not documented, nothing happened. So, here's a map also posted by the same article. The light purple dots represents the counties that reported no hate crimes in 2023, while the darker purple dots represent ones that did report. And something I noticed was that a lot of the darker dots are around the more major cities, like San Antonio, Dallas, Austin, and so on. So a lot of these rural areas, we don't know what's going on because the local agencies aren't reporting them. So that just goes to show that these local agencies are inconsistent and unreliable. Which brings me to my conclusion. Why should we care, and what are the next steps? So because of these vast inconsistencies in the local agencies, the only thing that I was able, Why should we care? What is next? In the words of Sherilyn Sarkisson, she's an American actress and singer, she stated that hate crimes are the scariest things in the world because these people really believe that what they're doing is right. These people believe that they should have no consequences and that what they're doing is justified. But how do we solve this problem? What can we do? In the words of Carol Rebus, she is a researcher and reporter at the Southern Poverty Law Center, she stated that we can't put resources and prevention into figuring out what to do or how to address these crimes if we don't have the data. So if these local agencies aren't reporting the data, we can't do anything about it because in our eyes, on the federal level, we're not seeing any problem. So really the only solution that I came up with was the FBI expansion. Because like I said in my counterclaim, what the FBI is doing is actually working. So this is how much land the SFPD has. The whole Bay Area, just the tip of the peninsula. That's how much land they have. You can see it zoomed in on there. This is how much land the FBI has, with each circle representing one agency. And you can see on a data table that I put in the different cities that have them. But when I was putting them in, I noticed that there was one in Huntsville, Alabama, the city of Gary Bravo. I couldn't help myself from thinking, what would have happened if there was no FBI agency there? His local agency wasn't there for him? What if the FBI wasn't? And as I wrote down here, some precincts cover other states, meaning that other states' local FBI agency is hours away in a neighboring state. As I said before, not all states have their local FBI agencies. We actually see this when we zoom in the Pacific Northwest. 5 states, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, North, and South Dakota. None of them have FBI agencies in those states. They're still covered by local agencies. Like for example, I would assume Idaho was covered by Salt Lake City, South Dakota was covered, looks like by Omaha, but you'd have to drive hours to find help. You should be able to find help right down the street. Why should you have to drive hours? And of course, I couldn't help myself from thinking again, Wyoming, the city or the home state of Matthew Shepard. His local agency wasn't there for him. He would have had to drive to Salt Lake City or to Omaha to find help, but unfortunately it was too late. So the FBI is a lot smaller than you think, as I've shown. In 2023, the San Francisco Police Department reported that they had 1,857 employees working. It's a good amount, right? It's a decently sized city. The FBI had 37,000. And when I was putting this data in, I was like, oh yeah, of course, that's significantly more, nothing is gonna compare to that because it's an entire nationwide police agency. So of course there's gonna be a lot more. But I did the calculations, and all workers for law enforcement agencies in California, excluding the FBI agencies, are 116,000. 116,000 employees work for local police agencies in California. That is 3 times the amount of people than an entire federal agency. One state has 3 times more police officers than an entire nation. But why does it fall on to the law enforcement agencies to solve this problem? Well, as you've seen on their emblem, as you've seen on their side of the car, as they've talked to you in presentations, they advocate to serve and to protect. Thank you. Are there any things I can clarify? So that was actually a really interesting thing I tried to research. One of my arguments in my essay was actually about like geographical location and how that varies and matters. So if you think about it, it can really depend because they might share the same viewpoints as the majority. In the way of, if I were to go down to Pacifica, it's a pretty liberal city, if I were to report a hate crime, they would do something about it because it's it's just more liberal, right? But if I were to go to, let's say, Huntsville again, and where LGBTQ rights aren't as open, they're not as accepting, if I were to go there and report a hate crime, would they really do anything about it? Like, would they think that that's the right thing to do was to commit the hate crime? So the geographical location matters because the people share your biases, they share your beliefs and stuff.
I have so many questions running in my mind, and we're not going to ask you all of them because we would be here forever. But I'm just curious why you chose this topic.
So my first topic was actually about Supreme Court justices and their term caps. And the first day of school, I started doing a bit more research, and I found that it was incredibly boring, and I couldn't find anything to do. So I actually took a criminology class at CSM. The guy I interviewed was actually my professor, and one day we had like this workshop where we had to determine if it was a crime or if it was protected. So that's where I got like the whole freedom of speech thing. And he actually gave an example of a synagogue in East Palo Alto that was vandalized, and there was a whole court case about it, if it was freedom of speech or if it was a hate crime. So I found that like variation really interesting. So yeah.
I'm still a little bit confused about like verbal hate crime stuff. So maybe about like any examples.
Yeah. So the hook that I used in my paper, actually, I was going to use on this presentation, but I wanted to include her in my verbal ones. So there was this woman, her name was Nina Tamani. She is a Muslim Arab woman living in Philadelphia, and I believe this happened in 2008, 7 years after 9/11. And I guess one of her coworkers believed that because of her background, because she was Muslim, that she was involved with the 9/11 attacks. So one day she walked into work, and there was a note on her desk, and it had a death threat for her and her family. And it said that I'm gonna hunt you guys down, you guys don't deserve to live, stuff like that, I'm gonna kill you and everyone you love. So I thought when I was reading that, I was like, oh wow, that's protected under freedom of speech, which is why when she went to her local agency, they turned her down. They turned her down because they said it was her freedom of or the coworker's freedom of speech. But like everyone else, she went to the FBI, and the FBI said, no, that's a verbal hate crime. And she was, the person who left the note was charged with 8 months in prison. Yeah.
Inconsistencies, if they're allowed to protect, they're not. Or Alaska and Hawaii, with the check marks saying they were either.
Yeah, they weren't included on the map that the slideshow provided, so I had to go and find like a separate image of it, and there was no way I could color it in. So I just gave like a blue check mark if they were covered. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm like, Kevin, love it, but got another question. So you said that there's folks can report to the FBI if they're experiencing like a hate crime. Do you know what's the accessibility of it? Meaning, like, I'm just thinking of just like your stats and just the folks who are experiencing the hate crimes, English may not be their first language, or they may not have access to a computer. I'm just curious if you know if there's like different language capacities, and do you know, and again, if you don't know, that's okay, how the FBI is actually sharing this information? Because I didn't realize there was like an FBI like hotline.
Yeah, so that's actually the problem right there, is that there's not any of that. as you can see on this map, it's not really that accessible, which is why they have the hotline, the tip line, the reporting surveys. Like, we're lucky enough to have one just, I believe it's in Sacramento, or just a little bit north. What I noticed was all of the FBI agencies are in major cities. So to answer your question, I'm really not sure, because that's where I found the problem, was that because of the 37,000 workers spread across all of these agencies, there wasn't enough room for to combat those language barriers, to have all of those resources. I believe the headquarters are in Quantico, in Virginia, criminal minds. So all of those at the end of the year are reported to the headquarters. Just like how they, the statistic I showed where 44% went to the agencies that reported the FBI. At the end of the year, I believe all agencies have to do like a year-end report, and that's where they get all of this info. So, yeah.
I have a twofold question. I'm curious if you found or maybe considered that the 82% of hate crimes that don't get reported to local jurisdiction is because they're committed by police agencies or affiliates.
Oh, yeah, so.
And then, well, the second part of that question is, if that is the case, and I don't know, I suspect, and the FBI being so outnumbered by those local jurisdictions, how helpful will the FBI be if it is the police agencies themselves that are committing the hate crimes?
Yeah, so that actually builds off of Haley's question up here. It's because they all share like that bias. So like if your friend were to commit a hate crime and you guys are the majority, you guys are the people in power, they're gonna be like, you're fine, I just won't investigate it, right? So the thing about local agencies is that the other agencies that like check on you also are around you, so they also share your biases. So like Pacifica can have some sort of correlation with Burlingame, that can have a correlation with San Francisco and blah, 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 right? Wyoming, same case. Idaho, same case. Like they all have that, the local biases, right? But if you're in the FBI, you can have people from across the country checking on you. So you can have someone from Salt Lake City checking on San Francisco or Sacramento and vice versa. You can have someone in Arizona checking on New York. Like there's a lot more overlap because it's a whole federal nationwide thing.
I have one more question, I promise. This is my last one. I gotta put you on the spot a little, you know, I gotta mess with you. In a good way. I guess the curiosity I have, and I don't know if this came up in your research, is how does social media play into this?
Social media.
Because I'm just thinking of like the hate speech and like when you're talking about that threat, like how a lot of that also happens on social media, and I don't know if that's something that you came across or, yeah.
It's not something I necessarily came across, but from what I know, what I can say is that like, you know how if you have Instagram, you can see like this post is censored, see why, and you can click to view it. That's what they do, because they can't limit your freedom of speech. And but there is to an extent where they can start filtering out, where they can restrict your account and stuff like that. It's in the terms and conditions, like you can't be discriminatory. It's really with the threats. So you can post a protest all you want, but you can't say, I want to kill this person because of X, Y, and Z. That's where they start to filter. That's where they start to limit your access.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Just echoing Dr. Michelle. You had a great presentation. It was wonderful. My question is more so process. Like, what was a challenging aspect for you while conducting your research?
So actually the most challenging part was the end, the conclusion, because from my understanding was I had to say yes or no, and my essential question was more on the laws. Like, should we pass more laws? Should the California State Assembly pass more laws? And I was like, I don't know. But what one of my many days that I was in here with Ms. Peters, she said that it doesn't necessarily need to be about that, which is why the essential question wasn't a yes or no. It was, while this is helpful, this is more important. So after that, this is where I really got a lot of my presentation from, was from the conclusion, building it around like local agencies, federal agencies, and stuff like that. So I think the most challenging part was realizing that it didn't have to be a yes or no. It can be conditional, if that makes sense.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. If anyone has one.
Yeah.
How did you manage your time with his projects and your with the other commitments this year?
So I'm an AP, so I had little to no time. So if you want more time, take regular humanities. Like I think they got the last 2 weeks to work on this in class straight. I got no time. or I got like 2 days or so. Everyone says don't procrastinate, don't do it the first night. Do it in doses. Like do a paragraph every night, you'll be in perfect shape. Bother your mentor a lot, they're here to help you. Very helpful. But yeah, if you want more time, you know yourself more than I do, don't take APs. Because after this project, you're going to be done, and then you come back from spring break, and now you have to prep for the AP test. So you're not done.
All right, we're gonna step outside. Everyone can just